Today's learning target is I can write fractions as terminating or repeating decimals and write decimals as fractions. One of the things today that we're going to do is we're going to write a fraction as a terminating decimal. And the word terminating means ending. So when we have this fraction right here, here's an example, 7/8. To find out what that is as a decimal, we can use paper and pencil and divide. Okay, so we have 7 divided by 8. Then you just have to remember to do the steps in division. Okay, so you've got you divide first, then you multiply, then you subtract, then you bring down. I always remember the phrase, "Did my snake bite?" To help me remember the steps. So it's divide, then you multiply, then you subtract, and then you bring down, and then you go back to dividing if you're able to bring down a number. Now you can see here that after we've gone through 3 steps of the divide, subtract, divide, multiply, subtract, bring down. So once we've gone through it 3 times, eventually we end up with 0. And so there's no remainder. In that case, this is what we call a terminating decimal. And this is the decimal, so 0.875, which would be 875 thousandths, would be the decimal for 7/8. One mistake that people make is down here. Sometimes people will write the division problem incorrectly. So they'll do 8 divided by 7. Okay? And you can see I've started this one out. I haven't completed it. But right here, this should be, if I do this, this should be the thing that tells me I'm not correct. Because I can see that as a decimal, when I'm figuring this out, I'm saying this is 1 whole, and then there's going to be a decimal as well. But 7/8 I know is less than 1 whole. So if I start this problem and I see I've got 1 whole here, that should be my clue that, oop, I made a mistake, because I know 7/8 is less than 1 whole. If you have a mixed number like this, 7 1/2, and you're asked to write it as a decimal, alright, so what you need to do here is the whole number is going to be what's before the decimal. So in this case you'd have 7 and then you have your decimal, because you're saying that's 7 wholes. And now I need to take this half and put it as a decimal. Now you might know that half for a decimal you show it as 0.5, but if you didn't, you would just take it and you would do your division, okay, and you'd say, okay, 2 goes into 10 5 times. 5 times 2 is 10, and you're left with nothing. So there's my decimal. So I would have 7.5 is my decimal for 7 1/2. The next thing we're going to look at is writing fractions as repeating decimals. Now you can see I've set up the fraction 5/12 right here, and I've set that up as a division problem, making sure that I've written it correctly. So first thing I'm going to do is, how many times does 12 go into 5? And it doesn't. So I'm going to put my 0 here, then I'm going to need to add a 0 there, and I put the decimal there, and as soon as I put the decimal there, I place it up here. Alright, now 12 goes into 50. I know 4 times without going over. 4 times 12 is 48. Now I subtract. I'm left with 2, and I'm going to bring down. I have to put a 0 here. Okay. Back to my dividing here, so I take, how many times does 12 go into 20? That'll be 1 time. Now I multiply. 1 times 12 is 12. Now I subtract. I have 8, and I bring down. And I'm going to keep bringing down until I'm left with 0. Okay, so that leaves me there. Alright, now I'm looking, and I ask myself, how many times does 12 go into 80? So I'm back to my dividing, back to the top here. And I know that goes in there 6 times. 6 times 12 is 72. Now I subtract. I'm left with 8. I'm going to have a 0 here. Okay, so I have 80 again. So how many times does 12 go into 80? It'd be 6 again. 6 times 12 is 72. I subtract, and I have an 8. And you can see that I just now have run into a pattern. I can keep doing this, and it's going to continue to be 6 over and over and over. When that happens, we have what's called a repeating decimal. And so to show that, I would write it this way, 0.416, and I put what's called a bar notation above it. And that right there just means that the 6 repeats. So it's going to be 0.416 repeating, or 0.41666, and it'd go on forever. If you were to do that problem, that division problem on a calculator, okay, so that 5/12, you're going to see this sort of an answer. And you notice here, it's just going to give you as many 6s as your display will have. And the last one is going to round up right there. That's just your clue that the 6 repeats. Okay, so if you were writing that out, you would still write decimal 416. Okay, because that's what it would be as a decimal, and then you put the bar notation above it to show that it repeats. So let's take a look at one more here. So if I was asked to put 7/9 as a decimal, so I'm going to make sure that I have that positioned correctly here. Okay, so I'm taking 7, dividing it by 9. 7 divided by 9. Okay, so the first thing I do is I'm going to divide. Now I see that 9 won't go into 7 without going over. So I need to add a 0 here. Okay, now I placed my decimal there, so I've got to go here. Alright, so how many times will 9 go into 70 without going over? So I'm dividing here in this first step. And I know that will go in there. I know 9 times 8 is 72, so that's too many, so 9 times 7. Okay, so I just divided. Now I'm going to multiply. So 7 times 9 is 63. So put that here. Okay, now I subtract. So I'm going to subtract that. I'm left with 7. And I need to bring down. Okay, I don't do remainders when I'm trying to find a decimal. So instead of doing the remainder, I put the 0 here, and that's what I'm going to bring down. Okay, so now I'm back up here to the dividing part. So 9, how many times will 9 go into 70? And there again, it's going to be 7. Okay, so I divided, now I multiply. 7 times 9 is 63. Okay, so I just multiplied, now I'm going to subtract. Okay, and that leaves me with 7. And again, I can't do remainders because I'm looking for a decimal. So I bring down that, and now I can see my pattern. I'm back to 70. So I see that this 7 is just going to keep repeating. So my answer for this would be 7/10 or 0.7 repeating, and I use that bar notation, so there would be my answer. If I'm asked to write a decimal as a fraction or mixed number in simplest form, okay, what I have to do is I have to think about how do I say this number. So decimal 2, when we think of our place value chart, okay, a decimal 2, anything that ends one place to the right of a decimal is tenths. So we would say 2/10 for this. Now we write it just like that, 2/10. Okay, now in simplest form I can divide each of these by 2 and I would get 1/5. So that would be the fraction for 2/10. The fraction would be in simplest form 1/5. If I have a decimal like this, okay, I would say for this one 6 and now there's 0.25, so 0.25 would end 2 places to the right of the decimal would be hundredths. So I would say 25 hundredths. So I'd write that like this, 6 and 25 hundredths. And now I can divide each of these by 25. And that's going to give me 1/4. So my fraction for 6 and 25 hundredths would be 6 and 1/4.